Some independent MPs have labelled the government's climate bill as a step in the right direction. They say it sends the right signal to businesses about the country's climate change action and plan to reduce emissions. But the government cannot pass the bill without the support from the Greens and Independent Senator David Pocock, who called for a climate trigger last week. Joining me now live is Independent MP and member for North Sydney, Kylea Tink. Kylea, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Will you support the climate legislation in its current form?
Well, let's be clear, the targets that we see in this current legislation are not adequate. And it's why, since the legislation was first drafted, I've been working hard with the government to push for amendments and changes in that legislation. That process has been incredibly fruitful, and we've already seen changes in the bill that came forward to the House that included increased accountability for the government and the minister as it comes to achieving these targets. With all of that said, I do believe this legislation is a really important symbolic first step, and it does send the right messages to the market, both domestically and internationally. And we are seeing that. We're seeing positive responses from the business sector in saying they want to see this legislation passed. So, yes, North Sydney's business will support this bill initially, but we still do have a whole day of debate coming up in Wednesday where I will be still pushing for amendments to this bill.
All right, take us through what amendments you're calling for. There's a 43% target. Is that enough in your view?
No, 43% is very clearly needs to be the floor. And I think we need to acknowledge that, in fact, when you look at the science, if this government did nothing beyond what the previous government did, we were likely to hit 42% in terms of our emissions reductions. So I do think, while I commend this government for putting this into legislation, the reality is this is the direction that we were trending in. We can do better than 43%, and we need to do better. We really do need to be targeting that 75% by 2030. That's what the science tells us. Our business community had already committed to being able to do 50% by 2030, and I think it's on the behest of all of us to be moving towards that target.
I want to ask you about the cost of living crisis. Of course, another interest rate hike expected this afternoon. Cost of living is in focus for so many Australians. Should the government extend the fuel excise?
Look, I think what's really important to note here is that I was very cynical when the discount on the fuel excise was introduced just prior to the election. It's very easy to say to people that we're reducing the cost of petrol to make it easier on your hip pocket, but what we need to understand is that ultimately it does cost us. It costs us about $3 billion for every time that this fuel excise cut is extended. So from my perspective, I don't think that that is a sustainable strategy for our economy. We're facing over $1 trillion worth of debt as a nation, and we need to start to claw our way back. What we also have to recognise is that it's a very different point in time now in terms of what's happening with petrol prices. From my perspective, I expect to see the government reinstate that full fuel excise, which indeed was the policy of the previous government. But I would expect to see that at the petrol bowser, we're still seeing lower petrol costs. And in fact, to me, that will be the more important issue, is to watch for price gouging as petrol is brought back into line to what we're used to paying. Anything like that is only ever a short-term measure, and it's really important that as Australians we recognise that it might feel like a gift at the time, but in the longer term that is a cost that we are going to have to bear and our children are going to have to bear.
I want to talk about housing. Your electorate of North Sydney, for many, would be significantly out of reach for those who want to enter the housing market. How can we make housing more affordable in this country?
I think there's a number of levers that we need to look at in terms of housing. It's definitely around the supply of housing. To your point, Danica, in all honesty, the federal seat of North Sydney is probably out of reach of a lot of people who live in it even now, in terms of the rising price of houses as it's come to be. I do also think we need to look at tax reform, and specifically looking at negative gearing provisions for multiple properties. I recognise that whatever reform we make in that space needs to protect the rights of people who have made investment decisions in the past and grandfather them, but in terms of a future strategy, we definitely need to free up stock to enable people to come back in, and we need to look at where we're building and developing communities that people will find attractive to move to.
Kylea Tink, we do have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us.